from the point of view of Zionism, it would be surprising that Zionists would regard themselves as victims. Why? Because Zionism was established as a project in the 19th century precisely to transform the situation of Jews from victims into active agents of their history. Any of the ideological tractates one reads, from Herzl to those that followed, will all argue that for centuries Jews lived, and this is part of the narrative, in exile. And in exile, Jews were passive agents that suffered history rather than controlled history. And so Zionist ideology developed an image of a new kind of Jew who was the opposite of a victim. The victim were the Jews who were in exile. The victim were the Jews who remained in the diaspora. In Herzl's view, they would just wither away when he developed the notion of Zionism. Or in one of his fantasies, they would collectively become baptized. He talked about a dream in that regard. So how did Jews come in their relationship to Zionism to see themselves as victims? It has a long and tortuous history, but even with the Holocaust as the pivotal point in which the state was created in 1948, after the period of the Holocaust, even at that point, Zionism was understood as a response that validated its initial ideology, that proved that Jews in the diaspora were radically powerless, and therefore Zionism came about to empower Jews. But inside the underbelly, or the unconscious, of Zionist ideology, there was nonetheless this idea of the Jew as victim that defined the opposite of Israel as the state, the sovereign state that would protect Jews from their passive, persecuted situation. And so, as you know, a lot of the discourse around this conflict often uses the Holocaust in order to label opponents of Israel, in order to understand the experiences of Jews during these wars. You have a history of Menachem Begin, who was a survivor, who came from Europe, from Poland, who talked about Arafat being like Hitler in the bunker. And Netanyahu was in some ways inherited that ideological narrative about the Jews as victims. And alongside that, or in opposition to that, Palestinians have also created a narrative of their own experiences being constructed, not just as victims, their identities as victims, but in particular along the same narrative axis of the Holocaust. So the word Nakba, the destruction, the catastrophe, mirrors in the construction of Palestinian national identity, the identity that Jews constructed for themselves around Zionism following the Holocaust. There's a famous story by a Palestinian writer, Ghassan Kanafani, called Return to Haifa, in which he describes a family in 1948 being displaced from Haifa and their child being left behind and being adopted by a family of Holocaust survivors who took over the home. And then in 1967, when it was possible for Palestinians living in the West Bank to return back to Haifa, they come back to their child, and there is a tussle for who does the child belong to. So the way both identities construct their narratives, their own national identity, and they are constructed or imagined identities, creates this tendency for both sides to regard themselves as indelibly victims, and as a result, there is an inability to see the ways each side is implicated in actions that are perpetrated and that create what I mentioned in the beginning of the talk when I talked about Obama's doctrine, a more nuanced understanding of history. It locks people into this radicalising ideology that keeps people apart in this pure virtuous state of victimhood in which neither side can peer over the walls that divide them and understand not only how the other side thinks, but how each side is incapable of understanding their own implication in actions and their own implication as perpetrators as well as of victims. And I think that's one of the discursive frames that needs to be addressed. And I don't believe that there is any way, if you read books by, and there's a book by Avraham Buruk, who's a former Israeli Speaker of the Knesset, and he talks about the Holocaust being over. We need to erase memory of the Holocaust from the political culture and language of this conflict. I don't believe that is possible, because the identities of both people are imagined inside history. The question is what you do with those narrative strands that construct your identity, and I don't believe that references to the past, and particularly to the Holocaust, lead one to regard oneself as a victim. Rather, the experience from the Jewish side of the Holocaust could allow a Zionist to transcend their own suffering and to adopt from that a strong posture in relation to injustice, as it does for many people. And so too can a Palestinian who is locked inside the narrative of the Nakba begin to imagine a state of reconstructing a state that allows for Israel to live alongside it, and that need not be an either-or situation of each side asserting themselves. So that's one of the factors that I think needs to be looked at. The second factor that I think polarises the way we talk about Gaza, and it came up a lot in the lecture last week, and the questions in particular, is this tendency to filter, particularly amongst academia, to filter understandings of the entire conflict through the lens of post-colonial academic discourse, and in an almost pre-packaged way to understand the Palestinians as the victims of colonialism and Israel as having been born in an original sin which it continues to exercise, and therefore delegitimises Israel in its essence. And this is a repeated theme that one finds in the language that is used, particularly in academic circles, but you know, I don't want to make generalisations, but it's a very strong kind of a way of looking at it, and one that is replicated in discussions as well about Gaza. And I just want to make a couple of points about that. The idea of, you know, Zionism as colonialism and therefore an illegitimate entity. You know, Zionism was born in the 19th century, and Herzl called his first society the Jewish Colonization Society. And so on the one hand, it appears totally anachronistic, particularly coming from a country like Australia, to try to apply to the past expectations of language and an understanding of the world that is divorced from the reality of how the 19th century and the early 20th century understood itself. But more importantly, Zionism maintains a claim that is also very paradoxical and contains different strands. On the one hand, it has colonial elements in the way it viewed the territory to which it came, terra nullius, and the way it viewed the Arab population there. On the other hand, it was an anti-colonial movement that wasn't supported by a mother country that sponsored people to come, into which the resources of the country were sent back. The British, who in the early days patronised Zionism, didn't continue to throughout the 1930s. But Zionism contains within itself claims to indigeneity, as well as claims to coming there using 19th century ideologies of nationalism that are constructed in ways that all nations in the 19th century were constructed and imagined. And I think the same is true of Palestinian national identity as well. It was Golda Meir who said there is no such thing as a Palestinian, notoriously. You know, Bibi Netanyahu came close this week to talking about a two-state solution with Palestinians, a Palestinian state and a Jewish state. And I think it's important that that Palestinian national identity is also a constructed identity. It was constructed prior to Zionism coming. It was a product of the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. Rashid Khalidi has talked about the early roots of Palestinian nationalism. But both identities are imagined identities that are products of 19th and early 20th century thinking that continue to have validity in the way that all national identities, including Australian identity, is constructed. Yet so much of the post-colonial discourse somehow delegitimises Zionism on the grounds of it being a constructed artificial identity, without recognising that all national identities are constructed. And the argument continues to say that Zionism, as in its self-definition as a Jewish state, is somehow illegitimate. But the idea of ethno-nationalism being illegitimate is something that runs counter to just about every structure of nation states in the world today. In Britain, the head of the head of the monarchy has to be an Anglican. Most states do not have neutral attitudes towards their population. And so ethno-nationalism in itself is something that is a common way of most states, particularly states in Europe, understanding themselves as the dominant hegemonious culture. The question there is how you treat its minorities. So I think the second point I want to make about polarising discourses is the danger of a language that grapples with the impact of the legacy of colonialism and imperialism being used in order to delegitimise Zionism as a state today, and how the language of delegitimisation fuels the sentiments that polarise and divide people and make it impossible to come to any kind of understanding. The third element that I want to talk about is the development in this globalised world of new technologies and new kinds of warfare, which are both new and old at the same time. And this is where I think an understanding of Gaza comes in. The phenomenon of terrorism is not new to this world. In fact, there are some people who claim, and I would disagree with this, that the first terrorist in history, or at least narrated in history, is a biblical character who committed his acts in Gaza presciently, and that's the biblical figure of Samson. That's an attempt to try to accredit terrorism to Jews. Samson, who was blinded in Gaza, and bringing down the house and people over him. And that's not true, and there's a whole history of terrorism that continues. But one of the features that we find in the Gaza war is a product of that, is the access to technologies of war that are used by parties in asymmetrical situations. And so you have in Gaza a classic conflict situation built on asymmetrical warfare, which is very much the stage in which so much of conflict is being reproduced in the world today. One finds it in many areas, in which the ability for disempowered groups, as was the case with Hamas in Gaza, to access rockets that become intolerable to states that are empowered, lead to a response against these insurgencies, a counter-insurgency response in which the disempowered side provokes attacks that lead to disproportionate actions by way of nature of these asymmetrical conflicts. And what ends up happening is that the state that is conducting a counter-terror operation begins to fulfil the very imagining that the disempowered group wants to project onto the other, people that are cruel, people that don't care about mortality rates. But in the case of Gaza, and it was pointed out last week, that in this asymmetrical situation, the death toll in a very short period of time was intolerable. Okay? Any asymmetrical conflict of this nature, which involves a counter-insurgency operation by its own nature, will lead to an intolerable situation where civilians are killed, particularly where the attacks are being conducted inside civilian areas, where the only way one can respond to it is because there is a blurring of the boundaries between the traditional battlefield, which was outside the civilian population. Now that it's blurred, it becomes a situation where a civilian casualty tragically becomes an outcome of these kinds of wars. But no one. The last thing I would want to do is in any way try to justify the civilian count, which, as was discussed, out of about 600 casualties, at least half of them were civilians, and that is an intolerable situation that results from these kinds of asymmetrical wars that are triggered through these sorts of operations. So the question is, how do we move outside these cycles into a new kind of structure, a new way of dealing with it? And what I want to suggest is that the fourth polarising situation that is introduced into this is the way the response of the world has been increasingly to try to deal with it through an international system of justice, which tries to divide the world into the guilty one and the one who is innocent. And one finds that in this new system of international justice, while it certainly has merit in dealing with questions of justice in the world, that it has become increasingly politicised by the United Nations, where just about every resolution held by the Standing Committee in the Security Council is against Israel, while there is no kind of, while there is barely a resolution against other countries and an investigation into other countries, where in similar situations of asymmetrical warfare, be it in Pakistan or in Sri Lanka, which had a much higher death toll in the tens of thousands, there is no investigation being launched in that way. And so therefore, I think there is a danger in using the paradigm of the law, as important as it is, in order to try to resolve the conflict because of the way that it polarises the sides and doesn't find a solution to the conflicts that need to be addressed. And so what I want to perhaps focus on in a conclusion is how one finds the end and the importance of responding to the tragedy of Gaza by finding an end to the story. And I think the danger is that in these situations, the ends often get written by the extremes. You know, in Israel, the settlement movement, which has an apocalyptic view of history in which a catastrophe could be the only conclusion to their view of the world, and on the other side, the increasing radicalisation of Hamas and the adoption of many of the jihadist ideologies, and particularly one finds increasingly the use in the Palestinian national in the Palestinian national camp, particularly on the Hamas side in the Charter, of anti-Semitic language, which really wouldn't have even been imagined by publications like the Sturm, and I can quote you things that are said. And we need to move away from those apocalyptic kinds of ends and adopt what I believe is the language that Martin Buber talked about, which is a politics that is inspired. He talked about prophetic politics, a politics that is built on restitution and on forgiveness, but a politics that transcends the realities of what exists in order to present a very real image of what can be achieved. And all the political processes that have been offered for peace up until now have actually not adopted the position of offering a final agreement in which all the terms are laid out. during the 1970s, the agreements that were made between Begin and Sadat were bilateral agreements in which the Palestinians were kept out of the equation. During the Oslo process, there was a determination to reach a peaceful resolution, but all the difficult issues, the question of refugees, the question of Jerusalem, the question of the borders that would divide a future Israeli and Palestinian state, all of these were left out of the discussion. And as a result, a new kind of process was put in place prior to the roadmap, and that was the process built on unilateralism, which was Sharon's approach, unilateral withdrawal from Gaza without negotiating agreements. And then we've had the roadmap, which is about people's responsibility on both sides, but at no time in the entire history of this conflict has anybody laid out on the table the final terms of what the settlement will be. And there's a reason for that, and that is that both sides in different ways find it hard to tear themselves away from their own polarising understanding of themselves as victims. Palestinians, and one hears it in response to many of the events of recent days, will still not speak about recognising a Jewish state as if somehow it is an exception to the structure of most states built on ethno-nationalist identities. And on the other side, Israel, to this very day, has still not presented a clear vision of all the elements that would result from a peaceful resolution of the conflict. And a politics that would be built on the kind of vision that transcends the limitations of all the problems of building a peace agreement now. For example, the threat of Iran, the division in the Palestinian camp, is one that would begin by positing at the very centre the outcome of what a peace agreement would look like. And that is an agreement that would give a clear determination to borders between two states, and one that would end the occupation in such a way that there would be a contiguous Palestinian territory and a withdrawal from most of the settlements, and one can argue about what the 1967 Green Line, and an image and a vision of a Jerusalem that will fulfil its own vision. Now, the word Jerusalem carries within it in Hebrew and in Arabic two words. It can mean shalem, which means complete, which fuels the ideology of Jerusalem united, Jerusalem not being shared, but it also carries within it the word shalom, or salam. And that image of Jerusalem as a city of peace, in which it can be the capital of both a Jewish state and a Palestinian state, is one which, if it was presented as part of an entire peace agreement, would facilitate the ability for both sides to approach each other outside this distrust and this discourse that divides into one in which people can transcend their own histories and bring their own particularities and their differences to the table, and create an understanding that will lead to a peaceful resolution to the conflict. So I'm going to stop here and open it up for any questions.